Picture this: a city on fire, loud sirens everywhere, and smoke filling the air. This isn't from a movie, but something that really happened in France recently. A 17-year-old was shot by the police, and this caused a lot of angry protests in French cities, especially Paris. The police sent out thousands of officers to try and control the situation. Cars were set on fire, buildings were damaged, and someone even tried to harm a mayor by setting his house on fire. Because of all this, President Emmanuel Macron had to cancel a trip to Germany to focus on what was happening in France. But why is this happening? Why does it seem like Paris, a city known for love and beauty, is always in trouble? Stick with us as we try to understand why there are so many protests in France and ask the big question: why is Paris always burning? Paris seems to be in the news quite often for its protests and riots. It's not just a one-time thing, but something that keeps happening. This makes us wonder, why is Paris, of all places, always caught in such situations? And it's not just about Paris. It's about France as a whole. We often see large groups of people in France coming together to protest. This is called mass mobilization. But why does this happen so often in France? What is it about this country that makes people stand up and voice their concerns in such a strong way? Let's start by looking at the culture of protest in France. Protests or demonstrations are not new to the French people. In fact, they are a big part of their history and culture. When French people are not happy with something, they don't stay quiet. They take to the streets, they raise their voices, they make sure they are heard. Now, let's take a quick trip back in time. The French Revolution in 1789 was a major event where the people of France rose against the royal rule. They were not happy with the king's excesses, the high taxes, and the rising costs of living. This revolution was so big that it ended with the king being executed. Then came the July Revolution, where another king was overthrown. And not long after that, there was a revolt against the successor of that king. So you see, the French people have a long history of standing up against what they believe is wrong. Even the French national anthem, known as La Marseillaise, is a song of revolution. It talks about taking up arms and marching forward. It's a powerful song that reflects the spirit of the French people. So the culture of protests in France is deeply rooted in their history and is even reflected in their national anthem. This culture of standing up and speaking out is a part of who they are as a nation. Moving on, let's talk about the intensity of these protests in France. When the French people protest, they don't just hold signs and chant slogans. Their protests can get very intense and sometimes even violent. Cars are set on fire, buildings are damaged, and the streets become a sea of people demanding change. For some people in France, protesting is not just about expressing dissatisfaction. It's a fundamental part of their identity. They believe in the power of the people to bring about change, and they are willing to take to the streets to make their voices heard. In recent years, France has seen some of the most destructive riots in its history. These weren't just small protests, but large-scale riots that affected many cities and led to hundreds of arrests. These events show the intensity and seriousness of the protest culture in France. So, when we talk about the intensity of French protests, we're talking about a deep-seated belief in the power of the people and a willingness to fight for change, even if it means causing disruption and damage. This intensity is a key part of why Paris is often burning and why mass mobilization is such a common occurrence in France. Now let's talk about why these protests happen. What are the issues that make the French people so upset that they take to the streets? One of the main reasons is stagnant wages. This means that people's pay is not increasing over time. Imagine working hard every day, but your paycheck stays the same year after year. At the same time, the cost of living is going up. This can make people very frustrated and angry. Another big issue is what some people see as elitist education policies. This means that some people feel the education system in France favors the rich and powerful. They believe it's harder for ordinary people, especially those from poorer backgrounds, to get a good education. This can lead to a lot of resentment and anger. These are just a couple of the reasons why people in France might decide to protest. There are many other issues that can cause frustration and lead to demonstrations. The important thing to remember is that when the French people are not happy with something, they are not afraid to stand up and make their voices heard. Let's take a moment to bring you up to speed with the latest developments in the situation. Today, the riots in France have taken a new turn. The protests were triggered by the police shooting of a 17-year-old. marking the third fatal shooting during traffic stops in France in 2023. This has led to a wave of protests sweeping across the country, with Paris being the epicenter. The majority of victims of such shootings since 2017 were Black or of Arab descent, which has added a layer of racial tension to the protests. The situation has escalated to such an extent that some cities have even imposed a ban on demonstrations. Travel warnings have been issued, and the unrest has spilled over into neighboring Belgium, leading to dozens of arrests. Over the weekend, protests rocked France, with the unrest sparked by the fatal shooting continuing. Although it was quieter on Sunday night, the tension remains high. In response to the escalating violence, police reinforcements have been brought in, and hundreds of people have been arrested. In some cities, curfews have been imposed on unaccompanied minors, and there have been dozens of arrests in Marseille. In Paris, police had to evacuate Place de la Concorde due to the intensity of the protests. This situation is a stark reminder of the deep-seated issues that lead to such mass mobilizations in France. The question remains, how will the French government respond to this crisis, and what measures will be taken to address the root causes of these protests? As we continue to follow the developments, one thing is clear. The spirit of protest is alive and well in France, and the people are not afraid to make their voices heard.